Thank you very much for coming and for asking me to be in conversation with you. It's a great honor because this is one of my favorite galleries in London, so I'm really pleased to be here tonight. The title of the conversation is Sicilian Metamorphoses, which bears a kind of intrinsic oxymoronic nature, because when we think about Sicily, if we remember from the novel The Leopard in 1958, there is this very famous quote where Tancredi says that for things to remain the same, everything must change. So talking about metamorphoses and changes in Sicily is quite a challenge. And I think that Oliver's project kind of challenges this idea of change and time, as we will illustrate later on. I'd like to start with Oliver's earlier projects, because I came across his work while I was assistant curator at Format Photography Festival in Derby in 2013, and we showed his series Bergheim Panorama from the factory in East Berlin. So these are a couple of images, and I wanted to ask you if you could tell us a bit about how you conceived that idea. You ended up in Berlin, and why did you come up with that project?
Sure. Well, initially I'd been living in Berlin from the age of about 18, on and off. And amongst other things, I was interested in house music and techno. And Bergheim is this kind of iconic, it's a former factory that has been redeveloped into a nightclub. And now it's like the most infamous techno mecca in the world, really. And as I was visiting the club myself, I kind of got interested in this notion of this haven of techno and basically this escapism that people used Bergheim as a way of removing themselves from the real world. So based on that, I wanted to investigate it a little bit. And there's also this thing of Bergheim where, you know, it's forbidden to take photographs inside the club. So that presented a challenge in a way, both literally and figuratively. So, I mean, these photographs are taken outside of the club in the industrial space that surrounds it. And I'm not really trying to reveal anything about the people in Bergheim. It's more kind of adding a layer of that mysticism and you know, making the viewer kind of question a little bit more about what it is about Bergheim that really draws people in, and why it is such a secretive society in a way. And then from that, I was interested in issues of German identity and how they deal with their past and their history. So I started to look into, you know, the history of Nazism, and basically I was interested in architectural relics of the fascist era. So I travelled to Prora, which is a construction on the north coast of Germany. You can see here, which was left abandoned essentially for around 50 years post World War II. It was never completed. It was an idealised, was purported to be the world's first kind of package holiday resort. It was part of this Kraft durch Freude scheme, which was the idea of work through pleasure and incorporating ideas of kind of mass and group recreational activities. And the reason I chose this building particularly is because it's enormous. It was at one time the world's largest or longest building. It's about 5 kilometers long, and it's very repetitious throughout. And basically it's been left dormant, but now the German government has sold the contracts or the rights to use and redevelop this space as a holiday resort, which is interesting in terms of how it's reverting to its original purpose that was never realised, and also this kind of erosion of history and the layering of history. So that's where I kind of took that.
And because there are quite a few projects on ProRA, but they usually tend to be kind of landscape photographs from the outside of the building, while you managed to get inside somehow.
Mm-hmm.
Could you tell us how that happened? Because I don't think it's open for the public.
No, it's not. I think usually when I approach a project, I don't always have a kind of definite vision when I arrive at the space that I want to photograph. So I had some sense of the outside of the building, but nothing of the inside, and of course that was what interested me, to see what was remaining. So I think I had to kind of go through a kind of air duct. I climbed up onto a ledge, and then there was a tunnel that I could crawl through with a friend who assisted me, thankfully. And inside I kind of found these empty rooms where the most that had ever happened was they were painted, and over time that paint has kind of started to peel away, but they were never fully furnished, and they were never used as a space. So I think if you skip to the next one, you can see here where it says, you can see the remnants of the paint on the wall, where it says Raucherplatz, which is smoking room. And I think that's quite interesting that it was never actually used as a smoking room. But nevertheless, that kind of erosion and weathering has occurred, and you can see visually the kind of history of the space. And I'm also interested in kind of trying to capture and trap that moment before it changes forever.
Yeah, in fact, I think in this series, probably unknowingly or unintentionally, we can actually see your first interest in inscriptions as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Which are very relevant to the markings project that is in the other room in the gallery. And then you developed some kind of interest in my home country, Italy. But in a very, being an Italian and knowing many foreign photographers that approach my country, I was very fascinated by your consistent way of avoiding cliché. And your very first project was actually in my hometown in Lucca, and in fact it's very much related with the ProRA idea and the temporality of space that are the way you document them just for a very short amount of time, and you can see the passing by of time in your images. They're quite kind of haunting in a way. I was just curious why and how you became interested in Italy and especially particularly Sicily.
I think I've always had a kind of some fascination, sorry about that, with Italy. I've been there a few times for a holiday, and also I'm very interested in literature and cinema, and particularly the films of Paolo Sorrentino and the way he used Italy's architectural spaces, and his also, he was very interested in ideas of Italian identity and the kind of inherent problems that Italians face in dealing with their history, and it's a very, it's a young country. And it also felt quite exotic, and I like to, explore new spaces. So at the time that I arrived at Sicily, it'd been a kind of, I'd had about a year or so since the work in Germany. I was living in Germany at the time, and I just felt like I needed to see something new, something very different. I remember I'd read Hemingway's Fiesta, The Sun Also Rises, which is this kind of travel, it's a diary as he moves through Spain, and it's a kind of coming of age, and it's about learning about yourself. So I felt like I needed this kind of experience, but I had a limited budget, and looking at Ryanair, I had £6 flights to Sicily. So I thought, perfect, it's kind of as far as I can possibly go in Europe at such a cheap price. So I booked a one-way ticket.
Did you know anything about Sicily before arriving?
Not before I booked the ticket. I think I bought a sort of travel guide before I went to Sicily. But yeah, essentially I knew nothing. I read Il Gattopardo, the Leopard, before I went, which kind of formed ideas in my head about what I was going to see, but you never really know what you're going to find when you go somewhere so new. And my initial plan was to, use Sicily as a kind of stepping stone to move up into southern Italy and around and travel up the east coast and leave via Genoa. That didn't actually happen in the end, as my trip was kind of curtailed. So initially I went around traveling, visiting various places, and it was all very exotic and interesting. And as I was in Palermo, I went out to a bar in the evening and met a few people, and some guy kind of came and offered me some strange Sicilian fruit. That's not a euphemism. And I stupidly took it, and I ate this fruit. And I didn't realise, because it was something that exotic that I'd never seen before. I ate it with the skin on, and I think unfortunately that had like pesticides or some sort of bacteria, and it really disagreed with me, and I was very ill for about a week, and I couldn't leave my hostel, so I had to book a flight back to England and just to get out of there. I kind of had a horrible experience ultimately.
Did you take any photographs?
Yeah, I mean some of
that
these.
Week.
Yeah, that week. I guess I had about 5 days before I got ill, so I was moving around and seeing a lot of things, and I wanted to do this kind of deconstructive approach to my photography. Before maybe I'd had this kind of German school, very clean, controlled approach, and so I just took a 35mm point and shoot camera, and I just kind of went out and did a very different approach to how I would normally take photographs. So I came back to England frustrated, and I looked at the images and I could see that there was the makings of something interesting, but not quite enough for a well-conceived project in a way. And that kind of sat with me for a few years. I had this bee in my bonnet that I wanted to return and finish. I don't like to kind of half do a job. So yeah, that was where I left it initially.
And then, because looking at your images from the series Il Gattopardo, how are we supposed to kind of associate it with the novel in a way?
Well, basically the novel, for anyone that doesn't know, is this iconic story of how in the mid-19th century Italy was divided into various different states, and then there was a movement to unify Italy as a country. Garibaldi landed in Sicily, and it kind of chronicles the fall of the monarchy in Italy and how that brought about change in Italy. So I just used that as a kind of blueprint for locations to move around. And the way I work is I take a place, I'll go there, and I kind of investigate it as if I was a reporter or a journalist trying to dig into a story, really. So I wasn't trying to link it too specifically with the novel. That was just a means for me to see something new and an excuse to go somewhere. So some of these spaces are parts of the novel. Other places are places that I just chanced upon as I moved. I kind of took. I started in Trapani in the west coast and went east along the coast and went to Catania and then back again to Palermo.
Yeah, and for instance, an image like that, were you sort of looking for signs of decadence in a way, or lack of progress?
I think maybe that's something I kind of gravitated towards. So, you know, Sicily, it's a fantastically visual place. There's a lot of colour, but also it's completely crumbling, and you know, buildings are kind of built on top of each other. Nothing's put together properly. So, you know, really, it's very cinematic in a way. And I just use that as a kind of a motif for the images to go with. I mean, I personally don't like to take pictures just anywhere. I like an architectural space that interests me and catches my eye, and I had a kind of infinite amount of that in Sicily.
Did you also speak with the people?
I try to. My Italian's not brilliant. I mean, the good thing with Italians is they talk with their hands and gestures a lot, and usually you kind of make the effort to, if you make an effort to kind of to initiate a conversation, they will continue it. And yeah, that was helpful in terms of finding a few places. And a lot of the time, somebody's living room is literally just a curtain on the street, so I kind of would wander in and find some weird places until somebody kicked me out, basically. Yeah.
And this is still from the series Il Gattopardo, but very interesting again. I can see a recurring pattern of drawings and inscription.
I think
that
this
you
is just.
You seem to be very interested in.
You know, I was climbing a mountain in pursuit of a different project, another. It was kind of, I had this sort of naive attempt at photographing a building settlement that had been constructed by the mafia without planning permission and never being completed because the foundation work had fallen away. Anyway, I wasn't allowed permission to go there, so I took a route around the mountain, and I noticed these strange stones on this trail. And I know it looks like a Star of David. I think that's just, you know, the way we perceive the image. I think it's just a shape with a triangle, and I kind of liked that with, it almost looks like a skull, I guess, the rock. And yeah, I'm always kind of drawn to the strange or the abstract, I think.
And then when you went back to Italy, the initial idea was to Sicily, sorry, the initial idea was to continue this series, Il Gattopardo, but something else happened, and that's why we are now talking about markings, which is a very kind of consistent and self-contained project where you literally like focus on a very small area of a very peculiar tree that is in the Giardino Garibaldi in Palermo. Can you tell us a bit about how did you change your mind? And
yeah, I mean, as I said, a lot of the way I work is in, you know, kind of exploring a space and using that as a kind of storyboard to come up with ideas. So for these images, I'd been traveling around doing this 35mm kind of diaristic body of work, and based on that I went to one of the palaces that are mentioned in the novel, which is now privately owned and there's no access to, but in the square in front of this palace is this garden, this Garibaldi garden, and it immediately caught my eye. These two, I think the park was closed at the time that I went there, but these trees, you know, the canopies are so large that they kind of fall out onto the pavement. And I took a few initial shots with my 35mm camera, but you know, the way when I see stuff, I kind of have a sense in terms of what kind of format would best lend itself to that shape. So I saw these, and immediately I knew that I wanted a larger frame, a larger print, and because of the details and the kind of intricacies of the bark and the engravings, so I returned again the next day with my medium format camera, And I made some wider shots of the park, kind of incorporating the architecture of the space, and some of the busts and things like that. And as I was photographing one of the cleaners of the park, essentially, the guys who kind of sweep the leaves away. But I didn't ask for his permission. I was just photographing him, and he was taking a cigarette break. And he kind of got a bit upset, yeah, but without saying anything. And anyway, I just gave him a thumbs up or a wink or something, trying to alleviate the tension. And that was enough. He came over and we started chatting. I didn't really understand most of what he was saying, but I did understand that he was telling me that the tree was about 175 years old, and that really got me thinking and made me kind of want to pursue this more and investigate and find out more about this tree. Before, I was only interested in it from an aesthetic point of view, but that made me kind of consider the history of the space and how that could kind of move into a bigger body of work. So yeah, I did that. This was toward the end of my second trip, which was October last year. And then I returned to England and I had the contacts and I could see that I had the makings of something really interesting. So I booked another trip this year in May, and I went back with the specific idea of finishing off this work. And prior to that, I then did a lot of research about the area and learned a lot of new things about the park.
Yeah, because it's a very fascinating park. It used to be used for executions in the beginning of end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, and in fact, it's where this American police officer Petrosino was shot in 1909, and funnily enough, they seem to have solved the case this year in 2014. There was a very interesting article on The Guardian, which is here if you want to have a read at the end, where they were basically saying that they found some kind of mafioso boss declared that his great uncle was the one who shot Petrosino precisely nearby the tree that really fascinated you, which is, as you told me, it's not a tree that belongs to Sicily.
No, it's not a native tree. I mean, as I kind of researched, I found out that this tree, the Ficus macrophylla tree, was imported from Australia in the mid 19th century to celebrate the landing of Garibaldi. And I found that really interesting, not only in that the oldest thing living in Sicily wasn't native to Sicily, but that kind of is interesting in terms of, Sicily right now has a very big problem with immigration. There's up to 2,000 illegal immigrants landing on the coast of Sicily a day. And they really, they don't have the infrastructure to deal with this problem. But also, it's something that is endemic to the history of Sicily. It's not been under one rule for a very long period of time. It's always changed after several hundred years. We had the Arabic rule, and the Bourbon kings were in charge of Sicily, and because of that, the genetic makeup of the island is very different to the rest of Italy. And I think, this just kind of perfectly surmises Sicily as a whole in that what unifies Sicily is the fact that it's a complete mix, it's completely diverse. And nobody is a pure Sicilian, everybody has a mix of bloodlines. And I found that quite interesting. And also, with reference to the detective, I think if you look into anything in Sicily, you often find quite a dark past. And that happened to be, the only ever police officer to be killed from America that was on foreign soil was in Sicily. But it also references the fact that at the time, Petrosino, he was an Italian emigre to America, and 25% of people living in New York were from Italy at the time. So Italy, now it's a very big political problem in terms of how they deal with immigration, but actually Italians have been a problem for other countries in terms of when they emigrated. So it's kind of a circle and a cycle there.
Yeah, and also the inscriptions are a very clear evidence of this circle, because in such a sort of dangerous space, like what this park was used for execution. Now, if you closely look at the inscriptions, there are always like young couples writing love comments about themselves, and almost trying to inscript like their love forever on this eternal tree. I was just curious to know why, what is the relationship for you between the image of the tree, obviously, and the text that is embedded? Why does this intrigue you so much?
The markings were, the real kind of, the thing that I felt made the images. They were the kind of point of interest. I think mainly because it's something that I think we can all identify with. Everybody really has scribbled something in a diary or on the back of a toilet wall or in a tree. And it's also something that has continued throughout human history from the very beginning. And it kind of got me thinking about ideas of, our own origins. And there was a film that I saw kind of around the time that I was at this park, which was Cave of Forgotten Dreams by Werner Herzog. And he's going into a cave in the south of France, which has the oldest cave paintings in the world. And what I was interested in is, in seeing this film, I could see there was amazing technique. Even up to 32,000 years ago, there was a kind of school of art, and people had real skills in drawing. And then there's a kind of devolution in form here in terms of the crudeness of the markings that were displayed on this tree. But I felt that it was quite nice, that unification of, the thing that ties us all together is spirituality and this idea of a lineage of history and our own place in the world. That was basically the kind of the thought process that I had in focusing on these markings.
And what about the titles? Because you're giving these very unpronounceable titles to your photographs. You're adding a further narrative layer that develops this very complex relationship between the original inscriptions that are embedded in the photographs and the title that are Aboriginal names.
Well, that was a kind of pun in a way, because I realized that people walking past this tree were interested in the tree, but the markings were kind of an eyesore or just a piece of graffiti, the way we would walk past a wall, on a street. But what was interesting is, you compare that to the way we elevate these markings from the past, and these paintings, and they're very protected and well looked after, and they're treated as kind of iconic images. So I felt by using those titles from Aboriginal engraving sites, it was a way of kind of elevating these to a higher level of artifact. And also, I think the names, the reason I chose Aboriginal sites was because the tree itself is Australian, and also it was used by Aboriginal people as a way of pigmenting their markings. So they would burn the bark and use that for black colours, and parts of sap were used for the red pigmentation. So it was a way of kind of referencing that and making a kind of circle of that history and delineating this idea of a sequential history.
Are you also questioning the way that the viewer is going to look at these inscriptions in the future in a way, through elevating them to sort of like art status?
Yeah, I mean, I find them very beautiful images. I like that kind of relationship between the natural, these kind of very figurative shapes of the tree, and then these markings. Although they're crude, there's a kind of a beauty and a symbiosis between the tree and the markings and a kind of harmony, I think. So I thought, by photographing them and placing them in this space, it was a way of, like I said, elevating them to the level of artifacts and questioning, what we decide or scientists decide to be, important to our history, and why something contemporary is dismissed or overlooked. So it was kind of mixing the two, really.
Yeah, and was this an idea that you had, because Oliver visited in Levan, so the Grotta del Genovese, where there is this very famous drawings. Were you kind of questioning also why these drawings are now so obsessively preserved and impossible to photograph, while contemporary inscriptions by young teenagers are just considered most likely offensive or intruding a public space?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I chanced upon this space again as I kind of had these ideas about prehistoric art. Speculatively, I kind of typed into Google cave art Sicily, and I was very fortunate that of the 3 caves in the whole of Europe, Sicily has one of them. This is on an island on the west coast of Sicily, a small island. And in France, the caves are very protected. They're actually now closed off to both the public and scientists. But in Sicily, as is the case with a lot of things, this is kind of privately owned, and you can pay. As long as you pay a fee, you can go, and a man will take you to the cave. And I was initially forbidden from taking photographs, but I kind of negotiated with him, and I managed to bargain to get this one photograph. And I quite like the kind of juxtaposition of those markings with those contemporary engravings on the tree. And I mean, basically the caves in France were discovered around 1940, I think. And at first they were initially open to the public. You could pay and visit like this. And then they realized that the breath, the carbon dioxide people were emitting was causing a fungus to grow on the walls of the cave and degrading the markings. So as a result, they kind of closed the caves off, and they threw away their key essentially. But before they did that, Picasso famously visited the cave, and he came out and declared that we have learnt nothing. And I knew this quote as kind of something. I mean, his images of bulls and things like that, they were as a reference to these drawings. So I was kind of interested in playing with that idea of, if you think about 32,000 years of human history, what we've achieved in terms of inventions and scientific progression, and yet, when it comes to drawing or making an image like this, we're still at that kind of base level, and we haven't advanced at all. So yeah, that was kind of my thought there, I think.
Did you see any couple in the act of writing
No,
on the
I
tree?
didn't. I saw a couple of people kind of kissing under the trees. I I mean, you can see some of them have dates. There are like, maybe there's a 2014 somewhere in terms of the actual engravings. But I was kind of interested in this idea of why do we make markings? Why is it this kind of democratic thing of why do we all need to kind of externalize our emotions? And I think that's something that's intrinsic to all of us. And I was kind of, it's nice to think about why we have this kind of faith in the everlasting, and how something as kind of silly and throwaway as, I heart whoever means something to us. So that was my thought there. And
do you think that this series is finished?
With regard to this series, I initially planned it as a kind of a smaller aspect of a wider project, looking at our kind of interest in the artifact and the way we preserve things and categorize things and try to kind of use this linear narrative of history as a way of understanding and reassuring ourselves of our own existence. So I have a kind of a bigger, wider project that isn't specific to Sicily that I'm working on, and the cave image will be part of that.
Okay. And are you planning to do a book?
Yes, I think I definitely would like to do a book. I see the Il Gatto Pardo series separately. I'm not sure if that's finished. I never quite know when I've finished, really. Especially with something like that where it's so, each image is so succinct and, kind of self-contained.
Also because you seem to get easily distracted by other projects.
Yeah, definitely. I kind of approach every project as though it's my last in a way, so I'm not kind of worried about what preceded it. So this, I kind of see it as the markings is one aspect of a larger body of work.
Okay. If anybody has a question for Oliver, he's very welcome to reply. Maybe not in Italian.
I have a question.
Sure.
About this picture and the previous one. Is that what do you think is because I make a similar series recently with graffiti with those tags on doors, which are entangled and kind of smash up, and then just to frame, some kind of abstract content out of the letters and the names. So I think the similar thing where the nature acts as a kind of additional letter to the alphabet. So that's how I translate it, because sometimes when tags get really entangled, it's as if another letter appears which is not in the alphabet, but it's A, B, C, D to Z, and then there's another letter which arrives. And something like this I can see here is a symbolic content important for you within a frame, or is it kind of depriving of a symbol of this like symbolic content?
Are you asking me about the crop of the image, or?
Procedure, because there's a certain dialectic of symbolic and not symbolic, I think. Because inscription is definitely symbolic, but then something which is happening within the frame that makes the material more important than the meaning. So it's got the material to the letter, something like that. And I'm curious if that's in some way the way you think, or do you think about symbolic and non-symbolic?
Well, the way I approach an image on a first level is the aesthetic and how that will look. And I deliberately kind of closed off the frame to not incorporate elements of the surrounding area. One, to sort of deny the viewer a sense of scale. In that sense, I can elevate what is a small marking to kind of a much grander scale. And in terms of incorporating the branches and the roots of the image, that was something, you know, I like the abstract qualities of that. It kind of made me think a little bit about sort of 1960s kind of, you know, abstract expressionists, like Cy Twombly or something like that.
And is there any like play with dimensions here as well? Because it's a kind of traveling inwards a bit here. Then
Sorry, what was
it was a kind of it's a bit it's not architectonic maybe, but it's spatial in a way. There's a kind of
in terms of the depth, yeah. I mean, it just depends on the particular space, really. I mean, this one had a nice depth to it, so you know, it's kind of what my eye sees, really. Some of them are a little bit flatter in a way. You know, this is a closer image. And this, you have
like 3D in a way.
Yeah, definitely. But I think that kind of makes it more confusing to include that background space, because you don't know the scale of it. I mean, it is a massive tree. It's kind of probably wider than this room.
I begged him to include a photograph of the park to give an idea of the tree, but he didn't want to, so it's your fault.
Yeah, I like that you don't have a sense of the tree.
But you can Google Giardino Garibaldi.
No, there's a question rather about the way you think, rather than just starting with the symbol and dimensions to see how there's another thing you're into. It's actually a mystery what there is. It's just good.
Okay.
I mean, it is a very special tree. I'm not, the technical details, the botanical details, are two difficult terms in English for me, but if you want to explain a little bit about how weird, in a way, this
it's a strangler.
germination.
It's a strangler fig. So the way it grows is that it you know, the seedling germinates in the body of another plant or another tree, and as it grows, you know, it develops to become larger than its host, and it envelops its host and consumes its host and kills the host, and then takes over that space. Yeah, a little bit like a kind of a cuckoo in a blackbird's nest, something like that. So yeah, the tree itself is kind of a little bit scary.
So the last question maybe, would you see this, you know, it can make a nice narrative, you know, just with the series of those trees.
Mm-hmm.
Could you think about any other accompanying series, you know, if you make a book out of this, what else about the trees would you probably see?
Well, like I said, it's part of this series about the way we deal with artifacts and the way that we need artifacts, or we feel the need to look at history and historical items to understand our own progression through history and kind of reassure ourselves of a development through time. So I'm working on a series that kind of deals with that and questions that notion. But it's difficult to describe, really. I mean, I would struggle to describe this without pictures, I think. Okay.
Any other questions?
You said you were interested in architecture, and that was a normal backdrop for photography.
Mm-hmm.
Would you consider taking this project into old architecture and doing a similar type of thing with graffiti?
I've always kind of hated graffiti. Yeah, I think this project kind of came about not through an interest in graffiti.
But the tree.
Yeah, the tree and the combination of a living thing with these markings. It was that kind of, you know, the harmony between the two, or disharmony between the two, that interested me.
Yeah, can I just add this is similar actually with me, because I hated graffiti as well, so I needed to frame it, to pick like little bits out of it, so to enjoy it. Right? So that I was making photographs of it to, you know, some kind of domesticate it.
Yeah, sure.
Are you concerned that the viewer understands the text, or does it really matter?
Well, I think, you know, the tree itself is a metaphor in terms of the layering of history. You know, a tree has these rings that age a tree, and, you know, it's a very easy way of deciphering the age of a tree. So I think, you know, all of those layers add something to the project, but it needs to exist for me on an aesthetic level, and you know, that's your way into the work, and if you're interested, you kind of read more about it. But they're not, you know, so fixed to the work. That's kind of I'm posing questions rather than answers. So I want people to kind of look at it and think about things for themselves and come up with their own answers.
Okay. Well, if there aren't any more questions, I would like to thank you very much for coming, and thank you, Oliver, and congratulations for being selected as part of 500.